The meeting is now recording and you do have a quorum.
Great, thank you, Melissa. Good morning. It's February 8th, 2021 at 9 a.m. My name is Suzanne Young and I am chair of the Vermont Climate Council, and this is a meeting of the council itself. Welcome everybody on this chilly February morning, but the sun is shining and it's much later at night here, so we're on the flip side of winter, I think. Today's agenda is to review and approve prior meeting minutes in the consensus format that Dave will walk us through if all agree that that's the right approach with the minutes. We're going to discuss the steering committee recommendations for the appointment process for the subcommittee membership. The steering committee has had a couple of meetings around setting up the subcommittees where we all know the bulk of the work and the research and the drafting and recommendations will originate. We're going to review the approach set out in the draft process roadmap by David, our facilitator from the Consensus Building Institute. I think everyone has had a chance to look at that in a couple of forms now. And then we're going to talk about next, I guess, February 22, which is in a couple of weeks. We're going to be having a full council meeting again, and we'll talk about the agenda for then. So with that, thank you. Welcome, David, and I'll let you talk about an approach for the review and approval of minutes. We have 3 sets to run through.
Great. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you, Secretary Young. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, so we have a 2-hour meeting today, and Secretary Young just laid out our agenda. The first piece of business we have is about doing the minutes. The way I'd suggest we do that is just if anybody has any concerns about those minutes that from council members, you can shout it out. Let me just do one quick note as well. We've got everybody on the line here, members of the public and others observing, which we're very happy to have. This is a meeting of the council, so we will make space at the end of the meeting for public comment. So please hang in there with us. And if you have a comment or a question, let's save that till towards the end of the meeting. And thanks for being with us today. So council members, we're gonna approve these minutes just by checking and see if anybody has a concern, see if we can address that concern quickly. If not, we'll just move on to the next piece. So in the 3 sets of minutes that were sent around by Melissa and that are posted online with the links, do any council members have any concerns about those minutes as a good representation of what happened in those meetings? Any concerns from council members? Great. Okay, so hearing no concerns, let's assume those are, and we'll treat those as approved minutes of those meetings. Thanks everybody for taking a look at that. Okay, so let's jump into our first substantive piece of work here today, which is around the subcommittees. And this is also, I will say, the first meeting that you all have had as a council where you've had a steering committee that got up and running at a tremendous speed last week, had 2 meetings to address this work, and is off and running in a very great way. So we have steering committee members here with you today who can help provide some flavor of what was discussed last week. I've got a few slides that I wanted to walk through quickly as a way of summary of where we're at. And those of you who are paying attention to your email on Friday evening, you saw from Secretary Moore an email out with a big explanation. So the slides I'm going to provide right now are sort of a summary of what was in that email, which is also a summary of what's happened in the steering committee in the last week or so. Okay, so if teams will work with me here, I'm just going to quickly share my screen and run through just a handful of slides. 5 slides. Here we go. And this is a way into the conversation around steering committee assignments and the next steps, where we've gotten to so far, and the next steps on the steering committee assignments. So here we go. Let me just put this into full screen. Give me 1 sec to make sure I have it set up correctly. Please shout out if you can't see this. If it's not coming up properly, just give me a shout out, but you should be able to see my screen at this point. Okay, great. So last week, the subcommittee met twice. And in one of its charges, as you had set out, was sort out the subcommittees and come prepared for this a slate of subcommittees for you all as a full council to approve today. The steering committee is recommending a different approach, and this is why. Last week, they heard from some of you and from other voices that this process of putting together a slate of subcommittee members, particularly the non-council members, felt rushed. And it also felt like it was missing opportunities to be more inclusive, right? So these were voices that were coming in the steering committee itself expressing some of these concerns. Also, the survey that went out to all of you as council members came back with a big number, right? 75 names for, approximately 20 slots or so for non-council members on the subcommittees, okay? So it felt like we needed a somewhat different approach. We needed to adapt what we were doing. And what was discussed, and you saw in that email, was what if we did something along the lines of a phased approach, okay? Where subcommittees could meet, get up and running as council members and the co-chairs. And their first order of business would be to sort out how to bring in the additional expertise and the additional viewpoints in membership for non-council members, okay? Second, what if we made this more open? And that survey that you saw go out Friday was the result of that. How can we be more inclusive, more open, and who might be participating, right? And third, being a subcommittee member is not the only way to engage in this process, right? So we need to be clearer about the different ways that you can engage in this process, in addition to the handful of folks who would actually join subcommittees. Okay, so, and you all had talked about that in your previous council meeting, talking about concentric rings of engagement. Okay, so what does that mean in practice? First of all, you saw a survey go out on Friday, and that survey will be bringing in or accepting responses up until the 12th this week. We're encouraging the subcommittees to get up and running with council members and their co-chairs, and I'll show you a list of how that shook out for the membership among council members in just a moment. I have a slide on that in just a sec. But your first order of business will be to look through the names of folks and try to decide who would really provide the right expertise and the right perspectives to be on the subcommittees, and then who are folks that we would want to be engaging with in other ways through targeted engagement. Okay, and then you all as a full council, which get back together in 2 weeks' time on the 22nd, could then do a final sign off on what the subcommittees have decided. Okay, so this is what the steering committee discussed and looked at last week, and is hopeful that you all as a full council will also be on board in the same way they were. Okay, just to give a little bit more context to this, and these are things that we looked at last week and the steering committee looked at last week, is trying to understand how this subcommittee membership decision fits into a larger process of bringing in a range of voices across the state, the right expertise, the range of diversity of voices that would make this project really work and this initiative work, right? So what the steering committee looked at last week was our process as a council must and should include some very targeted moments to do stakeholder and public and expert outreach. And there's two that are planned in the current process that you all have right now as a council, right? If from March through June, your subcommittees are going to be doing the hard, heavy lifting of coming up with draft ideas, as they're getting towards the end of that heavy lifting, and they have some draft ideas, you all have some draft ideas to share, there should be a moment where you are doing targeted and specific outreach, as well as some broader public outreach around those draft ideas. And the subcommittees themselves can be organizing that and doing that with staff support and support from a facilitation team and other folks, but it's the subcommittees leading the charge on that. So that's milestone 1 as on this slide, right? It's as those draft ideas are coming together and they're about to be brought up to you as a full council. Milestone 2 around targeted stakeholder and public engagement. You could also insert the word expert in there as well. Stakeholder and expert and public engagement happens after you all as a full council has had a chance to compile these draft ideas from your subcommittees, refine them, improve them, and come up with something that looks like a draft climate action plan. And that should happen, you know, in this incredibly accelerated schedule around the end of September into early October. Okay, so there's going to be another more targeted effort around that. Again, reaching out to broader publics in targeted expert and stakeholder. This is important because it helps illustrate the relevance of these concentric circles of engagement, which we tried looking at in this kind of format, right? That the members of the council, you all as council members, represent a diversity of viewpoints and expertise. Your subcommittee members, both you and now your slightly broader set of non-council members who are on the subcommittees, are additional layer of diversity and expertise. And then in those milestones, you'll be doing targeted stakeholder and expert outreach and broader public outreach in those 2 milestones as well. Okay, so the reason I'm showing this is that I'm trying to give a framework to think about how to handle the 100+ names that are going to come in. You already have 75, right? And you're going to get a lot more through the survey, most likely. So how are you going to do that as subcommittees? You're going to have some logic around it and understanding that there's multiple ways to engage. And I just put a few things on the slide right now, what the steering committee talked about criteria for how you want to be thinking of subcommittee membership and also about targeted outreach, right? Where there's an issue of expertise and there's an issue of important viewpoints that are brought to the table, right? To provide some balance, okay? Both in subcommittee membership and in the targeted work you're going to do in these milestones. Okay, so I didn't want to show much else. I'll say one other thing is that the survey itself that went out on Friday already signals this idea of circles of engagement and options for engagement. Right? The survey asks, you know, what type of engagement would best suit this person, right? This person you're recommending should be involved in the subcommittee process, right? So would they want to stay apprised or, you know, be part of targeted outreach, attend subcommittee meetings, or actually be a subcommittee member, which requires a level of commitment and time that's pretty significant. Okay, so that's what's in the survey right now. And it's a nod to the fact that there's multiple ways to be engaged. Secretary Moore has done heroic efforts through that survey last week and then subsequent follow-up work. And you shall see in this list of you all, the council members, in the subcommittee list, whatever your first or second choice was, you got it. And this was a way to provide some you know, balance across the subcommittees and everybody gets their first or second choice. There's also been more work done by the administration to clarify the co-chairs and who's going to co-chair the different subcommittees. So this, and I don't know, Secretary Moore, if you want to say anything more about this because you've done the heavy lifting to make this work.
I think you covered the high points, David. I would only add that the cross-sector mitigation committee we recognize may ultimately need to have working groups or some other ability to draw in probably more people than the remaining 4 subcommittees, just by virtue of the fact that this is likely where the sector by sector evaluation will take place. And so there's a recognition that even though it shows, you know, an ideal composition of 8 to 10 members, that there may be more on that committee.
Yeah, thanks. That's right. And I'll point out another thing that's been discussed by you all as a council and by the steering committee is that the Just Transition Subcommittee and the Science and Data Subcommittees are both subcommittees that have a slightly different flavor because they're somewhat at the service of the other subcommittees. So their process might be somewhat different, and one or both of them may find themselves somewhat embedding themselves in the other subcommittees. So just as a note that because they are slightly different in nature, that they may have a different process and they may find themselves explicitly supporting or embedding or some other way of supporting the other subcommittees. Okay. All right. So that's all that I wanted to show you as a prep for this conversation and getting our heads around the subcommittee process. And I will go ahead and drop these slides so we can see each other a little better. And I wanted to open it up to council members now to have some questions or reflections about this. And I think my questions are fairly broad, right? First one is there anything that's confusing here that I just presented, right? And that would need some clarification. And two is, do you all as a full council have some suggestions for making this overall process better in how we get your subcommittees up and running and in the right way? So confusions, and then second, improvements on what's being put forward here for you all as a pathway on your subcommittees. Okay, let me just see, I see a hand. Jared, go ahead, please.
Thanks, David. I just want to note in the steering committee meetings that we had last week, you know, most of the time we were focused on the process and this question of enabling both council members and the general public to have, oh, I was hearing some feedback, to have some additional time to make nominations. And I want to thank Secretary Moore and the team that pulled together the survey results from council members and, you know, did that process to identify first and second choices and potential chairs and co-chairs. But I just want to flag that while no concerns were raised, and other members of the steering committee should weigh in, while no concerns were raised, as far as I can recall, about that list, there wasn't a formal sign-off by the steering committee on this is the slate that will go forward. And one of the reasons I bring that up is because I had brought up in a previous meeting, and I thought that we had come to agreement and consensus on this, but it would be good to test, that we didn't want to preclude the possibility of council members that had the time and the interest from serving on multiple committees. So I saw this as the initial way to figure out the composition of the subcommittees where each council member was serving on at least one subcommittee, but that there were potentially some other council members who had kind of interest or expertise in multiple committees and perhaps available time to serve on more than one. I had just, for instance, personally expressed throughout that I wanted to serve on both the Science and Data Subcommittee and the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee. So I'll just raise that as a point of, I guess in your framework, David, that's a point of confusion, and I just want to pause there at some point.
Yeah. Well, I think it would be great to tackle that right now, Jared. I'm glad you brought it up. And so before I go to the next hand, I just want to tackle that specific issue, which is, do other council members have a concern with keeping open the possibility that you all can serve on more than one committee if you've got more than one subcommittee if you have the time, right? And so Jared, for instance, is interested in serving not only the Science and Data Committee, but also on the cross-sector mitigation. So I want to just test, does anybody have a concern with that? That if you all have the time to do it and the willingness to invest in it, that folks can go ahead and do that. Are there any concerns or other viewpoints on that?
David, may I comment on that?
Just jump in.
So I don't have a concern per se, but I just want to raise the fact that we're trying to keep the committees to 8 to 10 for discussion, and also recognize that we're trying to get this balance and bring in diversity of perspective, which is why we're doing this next round of surveys. So I just want the council to consider what that would mean then for having council members sort of staffing multiple committees and perhaps to the exclusion of bringing in different perspectives. So just wanted to put that out there for folks to think about.
Okay, thanks, Jane. Yeah. How do people feel about that? Part of this also is a question mark of how many of you council members are in a similar situation as Jared to say, yeah, I'm ready to do this. You know, if others are, this is a good time to raise your voice. If there's not a whole lot, then maybe Jane's concern, you know, won't come to fruition, right? So I just sort of test interests and opinions on councilors on that real quick, and then I'll jump, Erica, to your question. Rich?
Yeah, I guess my response is that we just heard from Secretary Moore that the cross-sector committee is going to need more expertise. And we also heard that it's important that data and science cross-connect. So I personally don't have any problem and would welcome Jared's participation in the cross-sectoral committee. I'm sensitive to the point just made also that we want to make sure we get a lot of, you know, diversity in points of view. And I appreciate the lead-in this morning about the concentric circles. So I think we're going to have to make sure that in the targeted outreach or advisory committee idea for the working groups, that we really pay attention to the folks who've put their names in or maybe haven't put their names in, but we should reach out to them anyway in that second circle. So I've rambled a bit, but I guess I want to say I'm okay with a limited number of council members serving on 2 committees. If it were to get out of hand, I think the steering committee would want to recommend constraint. And I really agree about the concentric circles.
That's great. Okay. Okay. So just to not belabor this point, but to actually try to say something very specific on it. Am I hearing that in principle, it's okay if particularly for folks who are, we've talked about this idea of embedding themselves in other committees or supporting other committees, particularly in these situations, it makes sense if people are willing and able to spend time on both committees. We need to be cautious that we are still creating space for that diversity of viewpoint and that other expertise that we want to pull in. Okay, so that's what I'm hearing, that yes, okay, and be cautious with a particular emphasis on that. Secretary Moore.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest, sort of building off of Rich's comments, that maybe the way to handle that is to say if there are folks interested in participating on the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee as a second subcommittee, that works, but otherwise membership in the other 4 should be, people should limit themselves to 1. And I think maybe it achieves that balance, as well as the sort of reflects the interconnectedness of the work of the cross-sector mitigation committee ultimately in looking broadly at possible solutions.
Okay, does that work for everybody? Secretary Moore's suggestion? I have a hard time seeing everybody's faces, but I think that's okay. And Erica's been so patient with her hand up. I appreciate that. And before Erica, if you have, is your question related to this point or is it a separate point?
It's a separate point, and it's a quick clarification on finalization of subcommittee composition and who is making that final determination, if it's the council by vote in consensus or if it's the co-chairs of the subcommittees.
Yeah. Let me just hold that for 1 second, and then we'll jump back to that in 1 second. To finalize this issue of serving on more than one subcommittee, Secretary Moore puts out there this idea of, particularly for the, it works for this cross-sector group, let's not do that in others. So does that seem like a good landing place for everyone? Can folks, does that feel like the right approach? Does anyone have a different approach than what Secretary Moore just said of yes, okay for the cross sector, let's not do in others? Is that going to work for everybody? Any concerns? Okay. Right. Okay, and then Erica's question about who actually is deciding. What was suggested here is that the co-chairs with the council members who are on that subcommittee do the sort and the thinking of it and make a proposal that works for their subcommittee. And then you all, as a full council, review that in your next meeting and give it a more formalized sign off to say, yep, looks great, go ahead. So that was the suggestion here.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to, I know there was in the slide, I just wanted to call it out for clarity.
Thank you. No, I'm glad you did. Yeah. Great. Okay. So are there other questions or points of clarities or ways to make this better? How are people potentially, confused is a strong word, but have some doubt still about this process? Joanna Miller?
Well, just a couple of questions. First of all, thank you again for opening it back up for a little bit more time. I think that's important. We work in very broad coalitions, so we threw it out there pretty widely. And we did get a lot of interest, and I didn't thread that into the funnel yet. So I'm just going to encourage people to do that in and of their own accord, because I got timed out of the survey. Sorry. So anyway, I'm glad we're going through this process. One question I had was, we didn't put out there that there was going to be a science and data subcommittee just because I wasn't 100% clear that we had decided on that. I don't know if we voted on that. I like science and data. I think it's important, so I'm glad we're having it. But so knowing that that is happening will be important. We will include that. I would just note that it says Thursday on the actual survey, but we're saying that it's Friday. So there just is like a little bit confusion out there in terms of when the deadline is. And
It's Thursday.
yeah, it is Friday though, right?
It closes Thursday at 9 o'clock, actually. Is how it was done by our director of communications.
Okay, I've just heard different. I heard Friday, I've heard Thursday. So just if we can confirm one way or the other. I thought at the subcommittee meeting that, or the steering committee meeting, you guys decided Friday. So just let me know and we'll push it out there widely, whatever that is. But if it makes a difference, I mean, maybe Friday, a little bit more time, just because I don't know how broadly it's gone out there. And then I guess one other question I have, and I don't know if this is the right time to bring it up, but I keep raising it. I do want to just understand, in the survey itself, it talks about, this being a volunteer commitment. I get that. I understand that there's a conversation through the budget adjustment process that would enable subcommittee members potentially to avail themselves of per diem. So if that's something we could confirm, or at least open the charter to amend later on to enable that, I think that would be great.
Thanks, Joanna. That's the helpful clarification on both points. And so I would suggest that when Jane or Secretary Moore's office can confirm when the deadline is, and maybe with a reminder email that goes out, and then double check that. On the per diem piece, I wonder, Secretary Moore, if you can say a little bit more where that stands and where that may go.
So yeah, two things. I do see that in the email that went out on Friday night, we did say it would be open Friday until 9 p.m. So Jane and I can work with our communications director to make that change. So since that was the information that I assume got shared broadly with networks, we will make sure that that is how long the survey remains open for. In terms of the per diem, I've had outreach from a couple of the budget adjustment bill has passed the House and is now with the Senate. I have had inquiries from a couple of senators about per diems and have shared with them the language that is in the Global Warming Solutions Act, which limits our ability to pay per diems currently to council members. I think what it will probably require us to do is formally seat our committees. I don't see a way where we can have people participate occasionally in a subcommittee and have it sort of fit with our ability to pay a per diem. And frankly, I think just administratively that could become very difficult to administer and oversee very quickly. But my expectation, or what I've heard discussed, is that the Senate will be taking up extending the ability to pay per diems to members of the council as well as members of subcommittees.
Thanks, Secretary Moore. And obviously there's a timing challenge on that where you can't say it right now, right? You can't say that that's going to happen.
Correct. We can't get out in front of the legislature. And I'm not sure if Suzanne knows more about the timeline in which the Senate is likely to act.
Secretary Young, do you want to just say something about that quickly, and then I'll take some of the other hands? Hang on one second. We can't hear you well. You may be on mute.
Yes, thank you. As of Friday, the Senate Appropriations Committee had passed their version of budget adjustment out of committee. It'll be on the floor tomorrow, and it did include an extension of the authority to provide per diems to the subcommittee members who are not council members. So the next step is that will go on the Senate floor for second and third reading, and then it will go back to the House Appropriations Committee to see if they concur in whatever proposals of amendment the Senate has put in the House passed budget adjustment. So it's on a good track. We probably should know early next week. More optimistically, maybe at the end of this week.
Right. Okay. Wonderful. So again, for folks who are, circulating this to their networks, I guess the best you can say is what you just heard, right? They're trying. You won't know till next week, I think would be probably the most accurate statement. Okay. Great. So let me grab some other hands. I see Sue Minter's hand. Go ahead, Sue.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I also appreciate so much the work that's been done to date. Great work, steering committee. So glad we formed you so aptly. I wanted to raise two questions related to the Just Transitions subcommittee work. And I have sort of done some brief email correspondence with a couple people on this, but I feel so strongly that I want to share the concern with everyone that we have a lot of work to do in this arena, particularly with respect to racial justice issues. And I feel it would be very, very important. In fact, it would be problematic if we didn't take action to ensure that at least one of the co-chairs, or perhaps we even make a third if need be a person of color. A member of the BIPOC community. So that's thing one. Thing two, and I super appreciate being able to be in a leadership role and would happily step down in order to elevate someone else into that role. My current co-chair, Sarah Phillips, with whom I work very closely and think is a great person for this role, feels the same way as I do, at least in terms of her willingness to step down to elevate another. I'm just going to throw out, maybe we think about a 3-person leadership role if there needs to be someone from the administration and someone from the council. Maybe that's a way to bring another person of color into leadership. The other thing I really want to think about, and it relates to the issue that Joey has been raising consistently around paying people. But it's also about the outreach strategy to disadvantaged communities. And we haven't really discussed what our public engagement process will look like, but I would like to put forward that for the work of the Just Transitions Subcommittee, I believe very extensive and thoughtful and different approaches will be necessary for disadvantaged communities who have not yet been engaged in this conversation, for whom I think we have a lot of groundwork to do and to reach into new communities and explore new strategies. So I don't know what kind of resources we currently have for public engagement, but when we think about those 2 milestones, I want to make sure that we are thinking broadly before we get to those, quote, milestones of engagement in the sort of typical way, that we invest and think about new ways of outreach. So I just wanted to lay that out there early on. Thank you. And to not only pay per diem for the subcommittees, but, and this might be the role that we talked about earlier, a philanthropic effort to have funds available to pay people to attend even a virtual meeting. I know that in our work, we pay people who are not otherwise able to afford childcare or whatever, so that I want us to be thinking about that as well. And I know that's a lot to ask, but I think it's what we need to be talking about. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, great. So 3 points there. One around the co-chairing of the Just Transitions group. You'll remember from the previous conversations around co-chairs that we brought up the possibility of a third co-chair, particularly on that group. So Sue's point there is very consistent with what's been said already. On the outreach strategy, that sounds like something that, with Jane and Secretary Moore and everyone, if you want to say something now about how the resources will be in place to do some of that more creative thinking around it, that would be interesting to hear. And then the third piece about funding for people to attend meetings, perhaps it's philanthropic. That's something that we discussed, you remember, in your last meeting. Maybe someone needs to run with that. Maybe the Just Transitions Committee, subcommittee can help get that working. Do folks have thoughts on those 3 that they want to share? I don't know, maybe Secretary Moore, if you have anything to say about how the RFPs are being structured to be helpful on some of these points.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So we are in the process of putting together a communications and outreach RFP that we expect to release certainly before the end of the month and maybe by the end of next week. And it has several components to it, including standing up a more robust website, and creating that opportunity for public engagement through the website that I know has come up in council meetings on several occasions, as well as helping develop outreach strategies, both around the development of the plan and the work of the plan is available to bring that into the public purview as well. We are closely coordinating that work with ongoing work that my agency's already engaged in related to developing a broader public participation plan and environmental issues of environmental justice. And think that there's a lot of synergy between those efforts and frankly, a need, as Sue had indicated, to build relationships in a lot of places where we don't have them currently. And just being cognizant of the fact that whereas, we as this group may see the work of the Climate Council and the work of the Agency of Natural Resources as 2 really distinct and separate things. I'm not sure the broader public would necessarily make that same distinction. And so that we need to be thinking broadly about the messaging and engagement and public participation opportunities we're creating around environmental concerns and ensure that we're bringing a complete set of information when we go out. And so that work is taking place sort of in-house right now, and look forward to having a draft RFP to share with the council, hopefully within the next week as we move towards getting that out. But I do think having that contractor support will be very important in helping ensure we have robust and a diverse array of opportunities for people to engage with us throughout the process.
Thanks, that's great. Okay, I think the next hand I see is Leslie Ann's hand. Leslie Ann, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you, David. I just wanted to echo a couple of things that we've just heard, including Sue's request for having public engagement as broadly speaking early in the process, so that a lot of the voices that may not usually be at the table are included as we think about strategies and solutions moving forward. And then the other piece I just wanted to say, deeply appreciative of the change in the whole process, because one of the things that I was hearing last week is people's capacity to be able to actually participate in the process and the ability to sort of bring their expertise into this space, both state employees but also non-state employees. And so I just wanted to sort of put our people at the forefront of a lot of the things that we do, and to make sure that we're doing this in a way that is supportive of everybody's mental health and well-being, because at the end of the day, we're trying to do all of this for our people. So just wanted to raise those 2 points and echo a lot of what we've heard before. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Okay. I believe I've got a bunch of hands that are still raised from before. So if you raised your hand previously and that's not a new hand, could you help me out just by dropping it down? Because I don't have superpowers on Teams to drop people's hands down. Okay. Other reactions or thoughts around this subcommittee process to make it better, or concerns or questions folks still have? Richard, is that a fresh hand? No, it's not. Okay, great. Other thoughts that folks want to, if you're having a hard time with the hand raise function, just if you're a council member, you can go ahead and shout out and open your mic up. Okay.
Hi, this is Catherine Dimitruk. I put a question in the chat, but I think it probably got lost in all the other comments. I'm just wanting to verify from a process perspective, do we need to use the survey to resubmit the names that we may have already provided earlier, or are those already captured?
Great question. Secretary Moore, what's the answer?
Those are already captured. No need to resubmit. Thank you.
That makes me happy. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, putting people first, as Leslie Ann says. Okay. All right. Anything else? Doubts? Ways to make it better? And please, if you put something in the chat, I'm not watching it. I don't know if others are, just because I can't watch the hands and the chat. So if it's something that that is a suggested change to the process, please go ahead and shout it out verbally so we can make sure we're grabbing that. Okay. Great. I'm seeing a lot of sort of points I'm agreeing and such. Okay, great. So as I typically try to do, I'm just going to share my real-time notes with you, and with the apologies that they're my real-time notes, so they're not going to be particularly pretty. So in this conversation we just had around subcommittees and how we're going to stand these up in the best way possible, this is what I just heard you all say. Right? We started out with the conversation about the possibility to serve on more than one committee, and we ended in a place of, yeah, that's okay, but let's restrict it to the cross-sector mitigation committee, because we know that's going to need particular additional expertise. Okay, so that was where we landed on that question of council members serving on more than one subcommittee. We had a question, when did the survey close? Secretary Moore confirmed that they'll make the change to make sure it stays open until Friday, as the email suggests, right? So we'll make sure on the back end that the survey actually does that. So that'll be open till Friday. Questions about the per diem. In that, we said it's working its way through the budget process. Probably the best we can say is looking good, but won't know until next week, right? At the earliest. There were comments about how do we get co-chairs the just transitions that reflect the challenges we're working with, in particular issues around racial justice, and an interest in making sure that one co-chair is a person of color, and the possibility that either one of the two co-chairs steps down to make room for that, or a third co-chair is added. Again, those are possibilities that you as a council had previously already looked at. And so I think going forward and acting on that seems like a smart move for the Just Transitions group to figure that out. Outreach strategy should be smart and explore new strategies, knowing that we haven't always gotten it right in the past, particularly for groups that are disadvantaged or otherwise haven't been as part of engagement strategies or outreach strategies previously. There will be funds for contractor support for outreach and engagement, and that can be helpful in doing that thinking ahead of time, so you're not caught unawares when you're ready to go out and do that. In building on the issue of funds, there was the comment of funds for people to pay folks to attend meetings, because we know it is a hardship to attend meetings for folks, even if they're digital meetings. And the comment was this could be explored as the philanthropic type funding that we talked about in your previous council meeting. Okay, someone needs to run with that and to figure out how to make that work. That seems important. And then I didn't capture well Leslie Ann's final point about, but this change that we're talking about, how to make this work, allows to put people first and keep people sane. And there's multiple ways to engage, and we will be tapping people's expertise in ways that feels acceptable to them. So that's what I have for my notes, and I just want to check, am I missing something here? Are there other things we want to say before we close out this section of the agenda on the standing up to subcommittees? Okay. Right. I'm not seeing hands or hearing anybody. My computer starts to slow down when I share a screen on Teams, so I just, I hope you hear me okay. Okay, great. So with these notes and the approach that was presented with the slides, I'm gonna take as agreement from all of you, and you all are agreeing that this is the pathway to stand up your subcommittees. So before we close up this piece of the agenda, any last concerns about how you're going to be doing this? Okay. Now, I will ask Secretary Moore and Jane. Oh, Richard, go ahead, please.
Well, this isn't a concern, but because you've listed it initially in your slides and in the memo, but I just want to clarify two things. Today, I believe we're seeking a decision of the council on the nominations of council members to subcommittees that have been laid out, and that, with the exception of members who might want to also serve on the cross-sectoral committee, that the committee assignments will be approved as of today. The reason I say that is that the next step will be for those people to assemble, look at the nominations of new people, and we need to know who's on the subcommittees in order to know who's going to get together to decide the next step.
Yep. Well said, and thank you for being so explicit about it. But indeed, that is what's happening right now, is we're saying yes to the subcommittee assignments that I put up on the slide. And if anybody would like to see that slide, again, I'm happy to throw it back up on the screen. And that is what we're doing right now. So Sue Minter, you want to go ahead, and do you have a point on that? Wait, hang on, Sue. I think your microphone's not open.
Thanks. Yes, I want to make that, it's very much to that point. I think you may have inferred in the review of the notes that the JUST subcommittee itself could decide about potential change of the co-chairs if we were to elevate someone into that role. But I want to make sure that that's accurate, or understand whether this council as a whole should make that decision, or at least make a decision to allow for that flexibility.
Great, thanks, Sue. So let's do that right now. For council members, does anybody have a concern with Sue and the other members of that Just Transition group to have that flexibility to add a third co-chair, or otherwise sort out the co-chair, the leadership structure of that subcommittee to address this very specific issue we've been talking about today? Do folks feel okay with sort of delegating that challenge over to Sue and her group, perhaps with the steering committee weighing in, having some, Sue, if you need some guidance on that, the steering committee's there. Any concerns with that? Kelly, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, just a point of clarification. Do we have room to make a non-council member the third co-chair? Is that something that we could do? Because that looks like that might be the likely solution. And I'm on this committee, and I'm in favor of what Sue proposed, that we should have a BIPOC co-chair. But it occurs to me that it may need to be someone who's not on the council.
Kelly, your statute allows you to do that. It specifically allows you to bring in non-council members in the subcommittees and makes no distinction about whether that's in a co-chair role or not. So your statute doesn't get in the way of that. Okay. So any concerns with having that Just Transitions group go figure out a smart leadership structure? Rich, do you want to jump in?
Well, I have no concern about it because I think they'll do a great job. But I do believe that as a matter of process, we should decide that it is the council as a whole that confirms the committee structure and the committee membership. And therefore, I would suggest that once they make a recommendation, that it be presented back to the council to be confirmed.
Great.
I just think this should be the process as a formal matter going forward.
Great. Okay. So so that seems pretty aligned with what we've been talking about in terms of the subcommittees confirming their overall membership and bringing that back to you all as a full council on the 22nd. So we'll include that challenge that comes back on the 22nd. So Sue and you and your colleagues there make a proposal, come back to the full council on the 22nd with your membership and your new co-chair, however you're going to sort that out. And that you all as a full council can then approve. That sound like a good plan for everybody? Yep. Wonderful. Great. Okay. Anything else we want to talk about regarding the standing up of these subcommittees? Okay. So yeah, go ahead, Johanna. Wait, hang on one second. Your mic's off, Johanna.
Sorry, I lowered my hand, getting used to the hand raising thing. This is great. Thank you so much for, being patient in this process. One other thing I would want to think about is, just to put a finer point on what Secretary Moore said, which is looking at, the existing council members and sort of rounding out like the expertise and the experience and the perspectives we want to bring. I'm curious about the process for, we're going to get a lot of names with a lot of experience and expertise and perspectives. To try and break down some of the silos, especially through science and data and the just transitions, wanting to bring those voices into the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. And I guess one of my questions is just logistically, are we going to see the full slate of folks who have been nominated to begin to answer and then help us think, especially the cross-sector mitigation? We certainly want to bring this perspective of just transitions and the diversity voices into that work as well. So it's more of a logistical question of process, ultimately in the end. But Jane's nodding her head, so yes, we will get that full slate.
Yeah, our expectation, I've been talking with the secretary, is that I have the full list right now of the 75 or so nominees. The cabinet members have nominated staff to help staff the subcommittees. I'll add that to the list. And then I'll bring in the full suite of nominations as the survey closes this Friday, as we amend the survey to make sure it closes Friday night, not Thursday. And then make sure that all the subcommittees have the full suite of nominees for their first meeting the following week.
Right. So again, it's moving at a pretty brisk pace here in terms of pulling it all together. Thank God Jane's on board. May her email accompany her soon. Secretary Moore or Jane, do you want to say anything about scheduling up those initial subcommittee meetings and the kind of support you all will provide the subcommittees in helping them do that?
Secretary Moore, I'm happy to jump in with the first round of that, but our expectation at the steering committee meeting last week was that The subcommittees will meet next week for their first time to pull in the nominees and make recommendations for membership. At that time, you'll also consider how agency staff will support the committees. And we've discussed sort of varying roles of agency staff. So there'll be agency staff there. They'll have limited capacity, obviously, but they'll be there to staff the subcommittees, both in providing, we see sort of different roles with respect to administrative support of the subcommittees, technical experience of the subcommittees, and then there'll also be legal support. And Matt Chapin, I see, is on this call too, and maybe at some point there'll be a chance to talk about how legal capacity will flow with the subcommittees. So I think there's a lot of moving pieces, and as those staff become clear for who will be on, what agency staff will be serving what subcommittees, at your first meeting, you'll sort of start to separate out who will serve what roles, recognizing that there's limited capacity. And then come back on the 22nd with a recommendation around all of that.
Okay, great. Sue, question?
Thank you, Jane. I just wanted clarification. Is there admin support even to help the subcommittee convene itself? To reach out and all of that, or should we just jump on that? Thanks.
We talked about this a bit last week. Obviously, the facilitation RFP is out. That comes back in this week on Friday. Facilitation support will be largely driven the Climate Council, but there'll also be a role with respect to staffing and support of the subcommittees, not in the same capacity that we are seeing at the Climate Council right now. So we're sort of going to walk a line between my role in help with the subcommittees, agency staff, and then facilitation. And I think trying to separate out and parse out who will be doing what will be really important in the first few weeks, in the first meeting or two.
I think the bottom line on this is co-chairs may need to step into that role initially as everybody gets settled in, and then there'll be staff support. There'll be other things that are sort of coming in as you get going. But I think in this very initial thing, the co-chairs probably need to go for it. Okay. I'm just going to share my screen one more time with the committee membership, just because I want to make sure this is kind of like the moment. If there's any concerns with where you got placed or what's going on here, here's that list. I've added Jared's name to the end of the cross-sector mitigation piece. Maybe I'll make it bigger. There we go. So take a look, find yourself, make sure you're, there wasn't some goof up, but you should have been in option 1 or option 2. And this is our guiding doc right now. Okay, any last concerns before I drop this off the screen?
So just one last point of clarification. If I heard both you and Jane correctly, that the co-chairs are in the driver's seat, at least for this first meeting, to get the ball rolling with getting folks together. Is that correct? Yeah,
I think so. Particularly because Jane's going to be like somewhat hobbled this week for the first couple days.
Nope, not a problem. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the folks on the Science and Data Committee to look out for a message for me, because I may need to change the timing of our meeting. So just wanted to give that shout out.
Right. And one other thing that we'll send an email about is that I think members of my team, whether it's Catherine or Pat Field, next week have some availability. If you want some facilitation help on that first call, Pat and Catherine should be able to do it. I will be offline myself next week with my kids, but Pat and Catherine are available. So if you would like some facilitation help, I think we've got the ability to help you at least for that first meeting. I'm seeing some extra hands. Go ahead, Joe.
It's not a concern, just clarifying. I see other state agency officials in sort of the co-chair roles, just a little bit, which is great. Just clarity around serving in those roles, but it's still the council members, like, who are getting the actual vote. I guess just a little bit more about the roles that other agency officials will play in these leadership roles.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Maybe Secretary Moore, you can speak to that point, like how you were envisioning that working.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in some ways, there's a little bit of self-determination by the subcommittees as to how they want to proceed, but I was envisioning a scenario where everyone who's a member, including the administration co-chairs, would have sort of equal voice and vote in the work of the subcommittee. I don't know that we can make council members have a different status than other subcommittee members, and frankly, council members will have sort of a second opportunity to discuss just as a council, because these are recommendations that are being brought back to the council for incorporation into the climate action plan. But I do think all members of the subcommittees should, I guess from my vantage, would have equal weight and equal voice in these conversations.
Right. And what we had said before, and you'll see when we talk about sort of this, process roadmap, is we talked about if there are any concerns around the decision making and the non-council members who are part of the subcommittee, that the council members of that subcommittee could be the ones who at the end of the day decide to elevate or not. And I guess so it does raise a question, for someone from the administration who, if that person is there in the representation of the administration voice there, I don't know. I'm not quite sure how that goes down, but again, as Secretary Moore says, it's like, these are recommendations that get put back up to you. So you all can say, you know what, at the end of the day, we don't think this is the pathway. Okay, I see a whole bunch of hands. I'm interested, if this is about this sheet here, why don't we go to Jared? Go ahead.
Sorry, David, it's not about this. It's this sheet. It's about the next step after we formally do this. So I'll pause. I'll hold.
That'd be great. If you can just hold that for a sec. Don't forget it, Jared. Abby, did you have a question about this sheet?
I did. I'm trying to think about the right way to express what I'm thinking. I guess from a public standpoint, or from I'm not sure. I mean, none of the council had any say in who the co-chairs that are non-council members are. We didn't have any say in how those people were elevated or chosen, which does seem, again, just from a transparency standpoint, a bit concerning. I mean, the rest of us went through, an application process and things like that. This is a tricky thing to know how to say in the right way. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just trying to bring up the thought that occurred to me, which is that everyone else here, there was some sort of process to get them here, and this seems a bit not in line with that same process.
Thanks, Abby. I wonder if this is an opportunity, Secretary Moore, Secretary Young, if you want to just say what was the process and what was the thinking that went in. And remember, when we last spoke in our council meeting, we thought, and you all thought, it was a good idea to have a co-chair who was part of the administration because of the importance of A, bringing staff support, B, because implementation is crucial on the back end, that folks are intimately part of this. Secretary Moore, you want to just say a little bit about that? And I welcome Secretary Young to jump in too.
Sure, I'm happy to. So what we looked for were the agencies that sort of had the most relevant expertise to each of the subcommittees' work, either through programming or just organizational responsibility. And so you'll see that under resilience, it's Director Borneman from the Vermont Emergency Management. Cross-sector mitigation is DEC. Just transition, Sarah Phillips, who Sue has indicated is doing a lot of work in that space. Billy Coster from my team on the agriculture and ecosystems, in part because it cuts across sort of all three departments of the agency, and Billy actually works in the central office and therefore has eyes and knowledge of the work across the agency. And then TJ Poor from the Department of Public Service as one of their sort of data gurus. I'm not sure. It reflects, I guess, a little bit of capacity within each of the organizations. And frankly, I think that's where it would get hard to have any sort of nomination process outside of the administration. Similarly, you know, I have a seat on the council by virtue as my position as the Secretary of Natural Resources. I sort of look at these co-chair positions as people fairly high up within the organizations of state government that have a significant responsibility and frankly expertise for this work.
Yeah. So that was the process, and I don't know, Abby, if you want to go further down this road in some way, it's sort of where's your head on this right now, Abby?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Okay. And then I believe Secretary Young, did you want to say something on this point?
Well, yeah, I guess just generally I echo Secretary Moore's explanation, and also the fact that, you know, the 8 executive branch members are here in what's called our ex officio capacity, meaning you know, in our appointed capacity. So we did not have to go through any sort of a vetting process because the legislature determined that they wanted representation from these 8 different entities, state departments and agencies on the council. And it is not unusual for secretaries and commissioners who have been assigned to a council to be able to appoint designees to help them carry out the work, because you know, there's real capacity at the leadership level, especially, you know, running an agency, and also with the legislature in session, that you are not going to get the full attention in subcommittees and council of, you know, every secretary and commissioner. It's just one of those capacity things that Julie talked about. So I think that the high level folks that are represented on the co-chair lines here are designees of each of the respective leadership commissioners or secretaries. And certainly, you know, if there are concerns, you know, we can talk about it, but this is, you know, the kind of the commissioner extenders and secretary extenders here to get the work done.
Right. Thanks. Okay, I don't know if those are new hands or old hands from Joanna and from Leslie Ann. I have a sense that they're old hands. Yeah. Okay, great. All right, folks. So let's do this. Unless are there other concerns or questions or clarifications? All right. Let me drop this. So to be very explicit, hang on. There we go. To be very explicit, what we're doing right now is you all as a council are saying, yes, let us go forward with this composition of steering committees from the council side, and with this process to fill out the additional slots in those subcommittees, and with this logic about how we're going to be working. So what you're saying now is yes to all of what we've just been talking about, the notes that I've shared, and the chart that I just shared. That's what we're doing, okay? So if there's any concerns about going ahead, now's the time to do it, or else we'll just say, let's do it. Secretary Moore?
It's actually after we finish this piece. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So can everybody live with moving forward as we've discussed this morning with my notes that I've taken in the chart we've seen? Great. I love the thumbs up. Thank you very much, Sue. That's great. All right. Okay. Excellent. So we had, we're pivoting to a new topic. I know that Secretary Moore wanted to say something and Jared wanted to say something. Secretary Moore, why don't you go first, and then Jared, and then we'll move into our next topic.
Sure. I just had hoped we could take maybe a couple of minutes here to hear from Matt Chapman, who's ANR's general counsel. There'd been questions at the last meeting about open meeting requirements and minutes and sort of other pieces around the work of subcommittees, and just thought it would be good if he could do a little brief level set in terms of what's going to be required for the subcommittees in conducting their business before they formally launch.
let's do that. I think that's very applicable, and then we'll see if there's additional work that, you know, additional guidance that needs to happen. Matt, do you want to say a few words here about how the subcommittees are going to need to function and stay out of trouble?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'm Matt Chapman. I'm the General Counsel for the Agency of Natural Resources, and was asked to come. And I'm basically going to address two issues. One is just basically the applicability of the open meetings law to the subcommittees. And the short answer to that is that the open meetings law does apply to subcommittees. So public bodies is basically the term the statutes use for what the open meetings apply to, and it extends to any subdivisions of those public bodies. So to the extent that this committee, this council sets up subcommittees that address the business that the council is undertaking, the public meetings law extends to those subcommittees as well. So the rules and sort of strictures that apply to the council itself will also be applying to the subcommittee. I think the other thing that I've heard has come up with the council as well is sort of the applicability or how the open meetings law applies to electronic communications, and specifically surrounding Teams, chats, collaborative documents, and so forth. And again, sort of extending, there's sort of two paths, which is basically the public meetings law applies whenever a quorum of its members, of the council or subcommittees members, are discussing the business or the substance that the council addresses. And the open meetings law doesn't really distinguish how that communication is taking place, whether it's in electronic form or whether it's sort of an in-person meeting. So to the extent that a quorum of members are talking about business via a chat, that constitutes a meeting under the open meetings law. If a quorum of members are discussing business via a document, a shared like Google Doc or some other collaborative document, the general interpretation and guidance out there is that that constitutes a meeting. So those are sort of the, and then I guess sort of the last, the sort of exception to the rule as it relates to communications and collaborations is, of course, if you're not talking about the substance or business, but rather trying to set up a meeting or conduct some logistical efforts, those are not obviously subject to the open meetings law and not subject to having to go and follow the sort of rules that apply. And I will send Melissa, there's actually that can be shared with some guidance that can be shared with committee members. The Secretary of State's office has put together a sort of comprehensive guidance that addresses the open meetings law and how it applies to sort of municipal bodies, but the same rules apply to the council. And then I guess I would just encourage people, to the extent that there are questions, I went back and these topics are also discussed by the presentation the Attorney General's office gave. So again, the sort of same concepts apply in this context with the subcommittees is the same as the council itself. So I'll stop there and then frankly answer any questions anyone has.
Great, thanks. I see a question from Richard on this.
Yeah, I do have a question, Matt. We've just been discussing how the subcommittees don't have decision-making authority. They're merely advisory. And so I'll ask the question whether that matters. Second question is, it's one thing to say that the open meeting or public meetings obligations apply to, let's say, working on a Google Doc. But I think we need some help on figuring out what that actually means. You know, I have no problem with a Google Doc being a public doc, and therefore anybody can dive in, any member of the public can go look at the edits that are being made to a Google Doc by members of subcommittee at any time. But other than posting a public notice that this document is there and people might be working on it at all hours of the day, how do you give a notice that at 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning the Google Doc will be open, for an hour, and everybody has to work on it only during that hour? I guess I'm confused as to what the guidance is going to say about that.
All right. So let me answer your second question first, which is how to. So the Secretary of State's guidance with respect to collaborative software and documents is that you don't use them, and I appreciate that is certainly not the normal course of business that people do in a modern age using sort of these collaborative softwares, but that's the recommendation, and the recommendation is that people make comments on documents and then a person sort of puts them together. So that's the guidance as it exists out there. Again, I appreciate the challenges that exist from the open meetings law, but that's the guidance. And I apologize, Rich, I'm forgetting your first question.
Does it make a difference?
Let me raise the same question with respect to an exchange of emails. I mean, we are in COVID. We're all separated. We can't be in the room together. And we're going to be discussing pretty complicated documents and trying to bring sources of data into those documents and trying to discuss dozens and dozens of thorny issues. And it's quite common to do that through the form of an email exchange. And like I said, I think it's great if any email exchange we happen to have is public, so anybody can see, who on the council said what about any topic. But providing notice to the public that I'm going to send an email to the subcommittee on Tuesday morning, it seems a little ridiculous to call that an open meeting. So it seems to me there has to be a way to accommodate an email exchange around a complicated issue inside the open meetings law while meeting the purpose of the law.
Right. So let me just sort of say at the outset, I completely appreciate the challenge that you're raising, and especially as it relates to the work that this committee is supposed to do. I think on the other hand, there's written guidance by the authoritative sort of administrators of the open meetings law that says that the type of collaborative email conversations that take place trigger the requirements for a meeting. So I think that's the challenge that we find ourselves in with the law that we have, and the general favoritism of both the courts and the legislature for an open sort of dialogue and the ability of people to be involved in that. We're, I think, seeing the friction with some of the issues that this committee may ultimately need to address. So I'm certainly happy to go back and sort of look at things, but I think the challenge is going to be that this is sort of where the authoritative administrators are at as far as the applicability of the open meetings law.
And Rich, I'm just going to be cautious of the time because there's one other thing we need to do today. I'm going to recommend the following, and I see there's a hand from Sue and from Secretary Flynn as well. Let's do a couple more comments and questions on this. I recommend then we all read those documents that Matt's referencing, and we schedule up a follow-up conversation, because that feels like this may require a little bit more, is my sense. But let's take some quick comments from Liz and then from Secretary Flynn. And Jared, I'm assuming your hand is for something else, right? So jump in if it isn't. So Liz, go ahead.
Sure, I can follow up with Matt separately, but Rich, while I understand the frustration, it's definitely consistent with understanding of public open meeting that the back and forth by email not be the way to conduct the business. I don't know if there's been some asynchronous communication rulings elsewhere in the country. We could look. And if so, there might be a way to actually post all such emails on a public forum so that they could be seen in real time and responded to if required. But absent that sort of asynchronous communication ruling by somebody else, it hasn't happened here, and I think we need to avoid it. And I applaud us for doing so far. Some people have sent out lengthy emails for us to review, but thus far we've kept the communication regarding those emails to the meetings, which is intended.
Yeah, that's right. You can send an email, you just can't have a conversation about that email. Right. Secretary Flynn.
Thank you, David. And Matt, this is just a question, I guess, and a comment to Rich's questions, but I mean, everybody, I think, clearly understands that the subcommittee meetings need to be warned, and everything that occurs in that meeting, if there's a quorum, is public record. But with respect to, Rich wanting to email someone, wouldn't it be the case, as long as there's not more than a quorum, if 2 people or 3 people, depending on the size of the subcommittee, were passing an email document and discussing it, doesn't that technically allow them to do that, as long as they have not garnered more than a quorum of that subcommittee? So the intention is not to, play an end run around the open meeting law, but if, to Rich's point, he wants to communicate something with Jared or someone else, isn't that allowable, even if they were discussing it as 1 or 2 people, or maybe 3, just as long as they don't have a majority of the number of those members of that subcommittee? Thank you.
So yes, technically speaking, provided that you do not have a quorum, you can discuss business of the subcommittee with the subcommittee members. I would just caution that to the extent that that email gets forwarded, there's a reply all, those types of things that would bring the other members of the subcommittee into that conversation, you've now basically violated the open meetings law at that point.
Right, and I agree, and that's good advice. I just offer that not as a way around this, to be duplicitous, only to perhaps address Rich's concern that, yeah, it's complicated. And yes, everybody, if you do send something out, everybody does have to be conscious of the fact you can't hit reply all, or you've accidentally just fell into that sort of box. But I just think there's a way to make it work, given the rules we all have to work within, and we have to work within those rules every day. Thanks.
Yeah. Secretary Young, last word on this?
Just the last word is, I think I said this at the last meeting, or perhaps at a council meeting. Got to be very careful about the open meeting law, of course. And if it's not maybe it does not constitute a public meeting, like an email with 3 people that stays within 3 people, it's still a public record. And there are a lot of challenges working in a very transparent, open process as required in conducting state business. So we all appreciate the challenges, and we'll all get through it, but we all just have to keep in the back of our mind that if it's not an open meeting, it's a public record for the most part, unless there's an exception that applies. So.
Right, and I think that's really important. And Matt, we don't have time to go deep in this, but this idea of that all this communication, whether it's public meeting or not, is highly foiable and highly, it's a public document, right?
That's correct. Yes. So all of the information that touches anything that a council member does related to their work as a council member would be basically a record for purposes of the Public Records Act. Whether a text or an email or whatever. So I think that's a separate set of guidance that everyone should be really clear about, because then that's why you had this email set up that's separate, so it's much easier to deal with that FOIA request or something. Okay. All right. I'm glad we went down this road for a little bit. In my mind, there is probably further work that needs to be done as those subcommittees get going, particularly as you bring in the
council members onto those subcommittees, that everyone's got to be on the same page, that everyone understands that when they write that email, even just to one person, it can becomes a public document that's subject to a FOIA request, and all these challenges, right? So let's schedule up something once those subcommittees are formed so that everybody's feeling on the same page. And thank you, Secretary Moore, for bringing this up now. And thank you, Matt, for being there as a resource. Okay, Jared, you had wanted to bring something up before we go to the next thing?
Thanks, David. Yeah, just at the risk of potentially stating the obvious, but in the interest of us all being on the same page and trying to have clarity on next steps, I just want to put something out there that is my understanding and see if I get head nods from everyone. If we are going to have nominations for subcommittee members open through this Friday, and one of the key pieces of business, one of the key agenda items for the first subcommittee meeting will be reviewing those and then coming up with a slate to recommend to the full council for composition of the full subcommittee, council members plus others. And since we have a state holiday on Monday, the 15th of President's Day, my understanding is that all 5 of the subcommittees would be scheduling their first meeting sometime between Tuesday, February 16th and Friday, February 19th, within that 4-day period, so that business can be done and an agreement come to that can be communicated or that can be prepared to be presented at the council meeting on the Monday, February 22nd.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'd welcome anybody else to say else. I mean, you all are working at a velocity that can be a little breathtaking. And yet it is the velocity perhaps that you will have to do if you want to achieve your goals as stipulated by the legislature. So I just want to recognize that things will feel a little bit like this. And then we can take the pauses like we did just now, right? The steering committee wisely said, hang on, we need at least a little bit more breathing room here. Okay. So yes, Jared, I think that's the plan. Okay, great. All right, folks. The other thing we wanted to do today was to look at that process roadmap again that we looked at 2 weeks ago and confirm that that really is where we want to do, and then figure out how we're going to solidify that for you all to have it as something like a charter or a roadmap or whatever you want to call it. Okay. To do this, what I thought I'd do is walk through those same slides I presented 2 weeks ago, and I'll show you where there were some nips and tucks based on your meeting and that we've also looked at in the steering committee. There is a separate document, right? So the PowerPoint is what we looked at last time. I'm going to show it again. You also were sent a more narrative document, and that just puts it down on page on a more narrative form, right? What I call the Microsoft Word document, although you guys got it as PDF. We're not able to, close that up perfectly today, right? And the Microsoft Word document doesn't mention, for instance, the project manager's role, and it needs to do that. There's some other things. But what we need to do today is look at this PowerPoint and make sure the content here is right. And then we can send around and do a final version of a more narrative document like that PDF you got of the Word thing. And that will become your sort of more solid, this is our charter, this is what we're doing. Okay, but let's get the content right on the PowerPoint. That's our goal for today. And then we'll figure out how to close up that other document that's more narrative. All right, so let me do another sharing of my screen. And we're going to walk through this doc. It shouldn't take very long. It's the same slides you saw last time. Okay, let's go ahead and do this. Okay, you'll recognize these slides from the last time we looked, from the last time we met. Okay, These slides go through the basic process components of your process. We talked about setting up a steering committee, right? It's done. We set it up. This is its roles, right? We figured out the numbers. We got this right? We got the 4 members, appointed members. We have names associated. That's why the little new is there. And then the new down here at the bottom is that spirit we talked about in the last council meeting, right? This steering committee is acting in the service of the council, organizing the work, but not in a spirit of controlling it or being some decision maker, right? It's that spirit, it needs to be present, okay? Those were the new pieces in the council steering committee. The rest has stayed the same, okay? So that's your steering committee. Next, subcommittees, what we've just been in the talking about this meeting so far. What's different or enhanced? On the left-hand side, just what we talked about. It's going to be a challenge to work under open meeting laws, right? We're going to need guidance on this, not just us, but the additional non-council members that come in. Let's make some space for that. Get Matt involved or others that can be a resource for us, okay? Then on the right-hand side, in composition, right? Previously, we had made some mention of, let's make this a majority of council members. You look at that list, it's not going to happen. You've only got 4 or 5, 4 council members per committee. So if you have 10 members, inevitably you're not going to be a majority. However, what we talked about, and I think it was, I'm trying to remember whose question it was. Somebody's question about, so who's actually in charge of the subcommittees? You can make a rule, and it's suggested here that you do, that decisions about what to elevate to the full council will be made just by the council members or their designees on there. Okay, so that was clarified as a way of working. In the next slide, if I can get there, nothing has changed. Okay. You'll see this second bullet on the left-hand side already anticipated the challenges that that Sue brought up. Okay, this has not changed. All right. Method for decision making. This sort of striving for consensus has not changed. The only thing that is new is on the right-hand side there, where we talked about for disagreements around the substance, disagreements around the content of your climate action plan, there is an opportunity to include multiple viewpoints in that document, right? What you talked about in your last meeting was, let's set a high bar for that so we're not littering our document with a whole bunch of miscellaneous views. If there's something really significant where you need to say some members felt differently, right? Let's set that as a high bar. Okay, and we'll just have to figure out what that means in practice when we get there. But the spirit is, let's set that as a high bar. Okay, public and stakeholder engagement. We looked at our circles of engagement. That's helpful. That visual is a helpful piece here. We don't have it on the slide, but it's a helpful visual piece. What's new from the last time you looked at this that takes in the considerations that you all said in your last meeting? One, very important to have some kind of website or portal or other ways for asynchronous engagement, right? And that is clearly something that Secretary Moore and others have talked about and say they plan to do. And then some smaller but still relevant pieces at the bottom there that you all said last meeting, which is this platform of Teams is definitely clunkier and more difficult and not as great for collaboration as a group, particularly you all, 23 of you, you've never met in person as a group. So is there a way to get on a better platform, such as Zoom, in particular Zoom? And then this question about the chat, particularly in Teams, where everybody has wide access to the chat, asking members of the public to hold off on using the chat until we do public comment at the end of each meeting. Okay, so those are some new pieces that came into this based on your last conversation. And we have this, which is unchanged. Okay, which is Jane's going to be playing an increasingly important role as project manager, and that you'll have agency staff at your disposal to help in the subcommittees. And what's not on this slide is also these RFPs that are going out. There are 3 RFPs, one for the technical assistance, one for the sort of technical and data type assistance, one for the facilitation assistance, and one for the communications support. Right, so those will be contracting support you'll have. Okay, now that long PDF that was sent to you also included descriptions of the subcommittees, and I have slides which I'm not going to show now in the interest of time, but on the back end of this slide presentation, which is posted on the website right now with the agenda, has a slide each on each of the subcommittees, like this one, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to walk through them now because we don't have time to look at that, but I encourage you all to look at those descriptions that are in this PowerPoint and also in that PDF document that got circulated around. Those are the best starting place that you all have right now about what it means to do the work in these subcommittees and the questions. Those will be what you all discuss on February 22nd, right? As you give a send off to your subcommittees. All right, let me stop sharing for a sec. Sorry. My computer really does act sluggishly. All right. So what's our goal today? Our goal is to confirm this as your process roadmap. The ideas expressed in this PowerPoint as the guiding ideas for your work from a process standpoint. Okay, so now is an opportunity to bring up questions, concerns, clarifications that you all would like to do so that we can really feel confident that this is the plan. And then we can consolidate that into that more narrative document and get that right as well. So thoughts about, again, the same, doubts, improvements, anything that's not sitting all that well with council members. Catherine?
Thanks. My question is related to the subcommittee descriptions, which we didn't throw up on the screen, but was in the PDF and the presentation. I'm still challenged with trying to understand which committee will be taking the lead to address the transportation sector. And reading the descriptions, that doesn't really jump out to me as being the role of any of the particular subcommittees, and given its importance to meeting our climate goals, it seems like it should have a more prominent place in these committee descriptions.
Yeah, great question. I know that Secretary Moore has been the most involved in trying to understand how different topics fit into the different subcommittees. Secretary Moore, do you want to say something about transportation?
Sure, and I think, Catherine, a similar question could be asked about buildings, because that's obvious. Building heat is obviously our second biggest sector. It is my, I guess, expectation or hope that this is work that'll be taken up by the cross-sector mitigation committee, and that they will be looking at each sector and bringing back strategies and recommendations regarding the opportunities and needs associated with each. There is a challenge here, to be frank, and I did what I've described as rubber sheeting and looking at the statutory charges to each of the subcommittees, and then looking back to the actual requirements of what needs to be in the climate action plan, and tried to do a little pulling around the edges to ensure we have complete coverage. But that those sector-specific conversations are all anticipated to take place in the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee.
Thanks, Secretary Moore. I'll just add then, in reading the description for that committee, that does not come across clearly. So I think there's some editing work that will need to be done there.
Catherine, are you looking specifically at the PowerPoint slides or the larger document that David indicated?
I'm looking at both.
Okay. All right. We can work on that. Thank you for the feedback.
Yeah, great. Sue?
Hi, I just put a quick question in the chat. I'm just daunted by, I guess, the idea that we have a complete subcommittee by 2 weeks from today, and wondering if folks feel we just have to bite the bullet and do it because we got to move fast, or whether we can begin and make some recommendations and potentially evolve from that point. I just want to have clear thoughts from the committee on that. The council, excuse me.
Yeah. That's a great question, right? Like, what really are you going to be able to get to you? Like, what should you as a council expect from your subcommittees by February 22nd? Is it the full final slate, right? Or is it something like, hey, this is our best as we can do. We have this slot open because we're still trying to wrestle with this. Is that your question, Sue? Sort of like, how far can we get, right? Okay. Do people have strong feelings on this? Because I think it's a great question, right? What should you all expect from your subcommittees on February 22nd? I'd actually push it back to you, Sue, for 1 second. Sue, what do you expect to be able to deliver on February 22nd to the council?
I expect to be able to come together with other members of this council around a topic for the very first time, a topic that is somewhat new, frankly, in the environmental arena, not to everyone, but to many, and very complex and needs a lot of thought and careful assessment of who all needs to be at the table, what sort of representative organizations or groups, not organizations, constituents. And I worry that 2 weeks from now, we could probably deliver a really good group, but I don't know that it's going to be effective. I'd like, somebody wrote back, how about we expect them to meet and reply back where they're at? And I think that might be more appropriate for our group at least.
Okay. Do people have some, thanks for that, Sue. Do people have other views on that? Again, I'm not looking at the chat, but I just heard what you read off, which is people should expect that the subcommittees meet, get as far as they can, and report back, right? That's what I'm hearing. Okay. Do people have a strong, maybe a pushback on that or a different view on that? Go ahead, just shout out. Yeah.
Richard. Yeah, I agree with Sue that it may not be possible to have a, completely dusted list by the 22nd, but I think we can ask each subcommittee to work hard towards, filling out the subcommittee membership, concretely and as completely as you can. And let's, push, but recognize we may want to make adjustments later as well. We may want to add some people later.
Right. Other views on that, and I apologize, I'm sort of losing track of hands because your hands might be about a different issue, but on this specific issue in Sue's question, are there other folks who want to weigh in from the council? Just go ahead and open up your mic, I don't mind.
I guess I had a point of clarification about the open meetings part and the communications around this, getting the subcommittee together, and how would that work and who would help with the staffing and all of those pieces.
That's a great question. I wonder, Melissa does such a good job of putting everything on the website and noticing, Melissa, can you keep doing that for the subcommittee? How is that going to happen?
Yeah.
Jane, are you going to do that?
I think Jane could probably speak better to that. I mean, I'm happy to help, but I think Jane or Secretary Young.
Yeah, I think we have a challenge in this next week with Jane not having access to email or the ability, I guess, to do that. I don't know, Jane, you mentioned earlier that you were going to be frozen in time while you transition electronically anyway.
I've started having back and forth with Melissa around the handoff of administration for this council meeting, for the council going forward. For now, we've been using the Agency of Administration's website. I think we'll keep doing that for now, but the hope is that we'll have our own website and start posting to that in future meetings. But for now, I think I hope, not speaking out of turn, that it'll be Melissa and I for this immediate next week or so going back and forth.
So I think to operationalize that, let me just suggest that the co-chairs of the subcommittees decide when they're going to meet, and that Jane and Melissa work together to post that with an agenda.
Yes.
And the link to the meeting. So if you all need to have more than one meeting, if we could, I'll leave it to Melissa and Jane. Who do you want those to send? Both of you?
Well, knowing that I don't have email right now, yeah,
you might get it sometime. Yeah, so I guess those should be routed through Melissa for the, let's say, for the next week, and she can work with Jane. But yeah, if you're going to schedule a subcommittee meeting, you should let them know the time, date, and they can set up a Teams meeting for you. Does that work for everybody?
I just had one last thing with Teams. Non-state employees cannot actually start a Teams meeting or host folks.
So I'm Melissa, do you have thoughts on that? Is that actually, is there a way to give the committee sub-chairs access? We could work through that, but for now it looks like it'll have to come from probably from Melissa until Jane has set up the invitation.
Happy to accommodate in any way. Anybody with a state email or a state account should have Teams, and anybody with a Microsoft account will have Teams.
And for now, this first week of meetings is really, I think, limited to the council members and the designees of the ex officios, who should all be in that boat.
Right. Just to clarify that, I set up a Teams meeting with Abby once, and neither of us were able to chat on Teams. So we both have Teams installed, okay, but we can't just start the meeting and talk to each other.
Let's talk offline about that then, Leslie, because you should have access to that.
Perfect. Thanks, Melissa.
Great. So there's some practicalities that are going to be, a little bumpy as we go forward. The message has been, transmitted that there's eagerness to perhaps provide diversity of platforms beyond Teams. So we'll see how that message lands. In terms of circling back to, I think, Sue's original point of, what really should you all as a council expect from each of the subcommittees? And Rich provided what I think is more or less in the chat, which is, let's expect that you all meet. Let's expect that you work hard to try to figure out how to finalize. And let's recognize that there may be things to solve that aren't fully solved by February 22nd. Okay, that's what I'm hearing as sort of the message. And I welcome anybody else to push back if they have a better way of expressing that to get the right level of incentive and recognition of reality. Right, so I'm glad, Sue, that you brought up that point, because I think, February 22nd is right around the corner. I'm seeing some other hands, and I'm not sure if they're fresh hands or where they're from. Secretary Young, did you want to say something? No. Okay, great. And Catherine, is that a fresh hand? Is that an old hand?
Sorry, old hand.
Okay, great. Okay, so what I've heard so far, then, I've heard about some questions of where things are showing up in the subcommittee work, particularly transportation, and that there's some a necessity to be a little clearer about where these big items are actually going to be addressed. Secondly, we just talked about what can be really expected by February 22nd, and we also talked about some of the logistical challenges, and there Jane and Melissa will work together in the next week or so to help co-chairs solve those logistical challenges. Email both of them, and between the two of them, we'll probably solve the initial problem here in the coming week. As I mentioned, facilitation support will be available if you would like it for those initial meetings. So the sooner you loop my team in, the better on that if you'd like some help. Okay, are there other things that we need to talk about before we give a more formalized, yes, this is our process roadmap based on the PowerPoint? Anything else that people want to bring up about our process roadmap? Okay, great. Rich, and then Jared, yeah.
Well, I'm just trying to hear whether or not you want us to sign off on all the language in the accompanying memo.
No, I don't think we're there yet.
Just the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. Jared? I think you're unmuted, Jared. I think you're okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was having trouble unmuting. Just quickly, David, because I know you couldn't see the meeting chat. Liz had a note on the process outline that needed to be adjusted based on the update to the subcommittee process that I just wanted to make sure got captured because I knew you hadn't seen we're having trouble seeing the chat previously. So it was.
Yeah. Great. Yes, exactly. There's a slide that talks about the process. You're right. It's not updated to reflect what we just did, our phased approach and the public thing and all that. Great. Yeah. So that will be obviously superseded by what we're really doing. Yeah. Thanks, Liz, for flagging that. Yeah. Great. Anything else, folks? Right. Okay.
I have one question. I'm sorry. I was trying to put it in the chat, but I think it's worth just asking. Because you did go through quickly a slide that I didn't really get. And it has to do with this decision about bringing someone from the BIPOC community into the leadership role of the Just Transitions. I recall that we made an affirmative decision as a council that one of the two co-chairs would be from the administration. So from that, I would assume that that would be the way to proceed in our case. And I just wanted to make sure that was sort of where we needed to go.
Any pushback on Sue's point? It seems aligned with what we've talked about. Okay. Yeah, I think you're hearing it right, Sue.
Great.
Okay. Anything else, folks? Great. All right. So, hearing no other concerns, let's assume that you all are signing off on that document with the notes we've just taken about it. The next step is to take that content and make sure it's faithfully represented in that accompanying memo. If you have other comments on that memo that you'd like to send over, please send them to me, and you can copy Jane and Julie and others who have been involved, Secretary Moore and others who have been involved in this. So if there's details of that sort of accompanying memo that you don't like, that we haven't addressed here, right? No, if we've addressed it here, then don't worry about it, it'll get changed. But if we haven't addressed it here, let us know. And then we can do a final sign off on that memo as your document going forward. But I think let's give that one more round because it definitely needs updating based on the content we've been talking about. Okay, great. Good job, folks. You did it. All right, we're very close to the top of the hour. We need to leave some space for public comment. I'm just going to say one thing about the February 22nd meeting. We know we want in the February 22nd meeting to look at what the subcommittees have done in terms of membership and see how far they've gotten and hopefully the slate that they have put together. The second thing to do in your meeting on February 22nd, I would recommend, is you give your subcommittees a solid send-off, right? And the solid send-off is, do we understand what you're supposed to be talking about in sort of the key pieces, right? This is where the write-up that's in the document now is a good starting place. And that is what I recommend you do for February 22nd is you really give your subcommittees a solid send-off with as clear a mandate as possible, understanding the scope of issues you want to work on, understanding, making sure some big issue isn't being dropped in between the cracks. Okay, that would be my recommendation. If you have thoughts on that, please email, and the steering committee can also do a better job of preparing a specific agenda on February 22nd. Okay. In the interest of time, I just want to open it up for public comment now. If you are a member of the public, you've been observing today and you've been patiently waiting to make a comment or otherwise throw something in the chat, I welcome comments in the chat right now, or please raise your hand and we can take some public comment now from anybody who feels they'd like to say something or ask a question. Just give it a moment here. Feel free to use the chat if you're a member of the public. Feel free to raise your hand. I don't see any hands, so unless it's my Teams that's being funky, I think we're okay. And thanks everybody who's been listening in to our conversation today. Okay, so let's finish up here. We have some next steps. We've talked about the next steps around the subcommittees and your upcoming meetings. We know there's some practical hurdles to make that work. Co-chairs, you're in the driver's seat, but please reach out to Jane and Melissa for help. And Secretary Young and Secretary Moore, anything else you want to say about next steps?
No, I think we're set. I think it is a tight time frame. There's a lot to do, and I think a lot will be driven. Our success will be driven by the amount of interest we receive in the subcommittee appointments. And Sue, in terms of the BIPOC member, I will reach out within the administration broadly. And then it'll be interesting to see what type of interest we may receive, through the solicitation process as well. I think that what I had noted is the subcommittees will meet and they'll consider all the interested parties and come to us, the best they can on Monday the 22nd with some proposals for membership or proposals for moving forward if you weren't able to fully complete that task.
Right.
And I don't know if there was I think I kind of heard out there perhaps a request for some additional legal advice, and if that's the case, we could put Matt on the agenda as well.
Yeah, great. And whether that legal advice, it clearly should include the non-council subcommittee members, so we need to figure out how to make that work, right? Great. Secretary Moore, anything else?
I don't have anything further to add this morning. Thank you.
Okay, great.
David, I did.
Oh, actually, I take that back. I have one thing I did want to flag for folks, which is we did the request for information did close on Friday, and we received 15 responses. So just a really high level of interest. And Jane, one of Jane's first orders of business is going to be working through those. But just wanted to let folks know that there is clear interest and engagement from the technical services community as well, which is great and will obviously have real value for us moving forward.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Okay, folks, we did it. And good luck, subcommittees. May the force be with you, and good luck working through all these great nominations you're going to get. And I will see you in 2 weeks. And like I said, facilitation support is available should you want it for your first meeting of subcommittees. Just contact Jane and or Secretary Moore or Melissa, and we can sort that out. All right. Have a great week, everybody. Take care. Thanks. All the best.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, you bet.